May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and Redeemer. Amen. Almost all of us know the story of the Good Shepherd, which we just heard, and most of us know Psalm 23 by heart. But how can we hear these readings fresh? What new insights might we find in them today? In both, we have the image of the Good Shepherd. Kalos in Greek might also be translated as model, noble, ideal, true, or faithful. There was someone who knew how to gather, lead, and protect his flock. This image of the model shepherd resonated with the people of Israel as they were a herding people. Their ancestral leaders, Moses, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and David, were all shepherds before they were called out by God in different ways. Or was it that different? When one becomes a shepherd, one learns from experience almost everything one needs to know about one's flock: what they look and smell like, which is which, what are their quirks, what they like to eat and drink, what makes them anxious, how soft are their coats, when to shear them, what to do with the wool, and how to care for the female sheep when they give birth, and care for the lambs that are born in the spring. With years of experience, it becomes natural and instinctive. My father had an instinct, not for sheep, but dogs. I don't really know why or how this happened, given his early years that included a fair amount of travel. But at some point in his married life, he took to importing dachshunds to Honolulu from Europe via Long Island. He would sign the necessary contracts for the show dogs and presumably make down payments, then wait for them as they made their long journey by ship down the east coast of the United States through the Panama Canal and straight across the Pacific to the Sandwich Islands. Mother told me that when he got a telegram that the dogs were arriving, he'd drive to the dock to meet the ship, make sure the animals were safe and well cared for, then accompany them to the quarantine station, where, if I'm not mistaken, they remained for about 6 months to make sure that they were healthy and didn't harbor any diseases that would threaten the island. Apparently, every night after supper, Dad would drive to the kennels to check on, become more familiar with, bond, and discipline the dogs. And at the end of these periods, I understand, he'd bring the dogs to our home and place them in the fenced backyard where they would roam and be properly trained in order to eventually show at American Kennel Club competitions. My father had an intuitive, instinctive sense about animals. By the time I was born, we had only one remaining dachshund, which was supposedly my pet, not a show dog. But I would watch him train her for me in the yard, after dinner, in the night, sometimes by moonlight. There was something intimate, secure, and comforting about it all. The parable of the model shepherd speaks of a leader who knows his or her flock intimately and intuitively, takes care of them, protects them, and when necessary, even goes so far as to place himself between any threat and the flock, any imposter and the herd. He was clearly not a hired hand who would bail out at the threat of danger or the slightest problem. You've heard, if you don't do it my way, I'll leave. Naturally, some pastors who tend and lead their congregation call on the image of God in Jesus as the model shepherd. The title pastor conjures up pastoral scenes, doesn't it? Pastor in Latin actually means herdsman, and hence the Pope and bishops are awarded crooks as part of their liturgical guard. They poke but don't hurt their herd. Like so, we ordained feel called to gather, to feed, minister to, take care of, and even defend our flocks to the end. Pastoral calling, pastoral visiting, pastoral counseling lie at the heart of pastoral ministries. Our covenant contracts uphold and spell out these special responsibilities, as well as delegations to others. Going deeper into our parable of the model shepherd, we find ourselves asking, what has continued and what is changing in our communities of faith? It is clear that there has always been a yearning for community, as far back as the early church. And also during the Second World War, there was a learning about faith, how loved ones and communities had to be separated for a higher cause, new allegiances and groups formed, and how after the fighting had ended and camps liberated, families and communities were reunited or individuals reconciled to rebuild this nation in a spirit of gratitude and hopefulness. Today, however, we still yearn for communities of like-minded people, but we seem to be pulling apart at the seams. In spite of its amazing benefits, technology increases information gathering and sharing at exponential speeds, but has the potential to fragment whole swaths of our society. I call my cell phone my other brain, but I'm drawn to it sometimes when there are people nearby. Facebooking, texting, instant messaging, instead of talking face to face, individually or in groups. We resort to off-the-cuff responses without much care or deep thought, and relate in staccato shorthand without punctuations and salutations. This past week, we learned that Comcast and Time Warner were turned down from a merger over broadband. I listened to many of the possibilities of how providers will be bundling our television and cable programs, broadcasts, sports, and so on and so forth. What struck me was how we seem to be losing control of our own choices and being prepackaged, siloed, if you will, into general subjects. More so, how common discourse, good church conversation seems to be fading into the sunset, except with a few. Instead of having reputable journalists deliver our news, journalists who did their research were responsible to their networks, criticism, and correction, we now have models and former athletes and failed political wannabes delivering slanted and hyped reports in order to draw audiences and without necessarily being informed and balanced about the facts. After becoming splintered up by some media and bundled, I think we may need community and conversation even more to be a whole and compassionate people. We who set the tone of media markets by what we buy may need to project expectations of press and public officials, not as hirelings, but as good and model for us. Our parable today speaks of the model shepherd who, through mutuality with God, knows his and her people well over time, and ever seeks to draw together diverse members into one united body. Draw it together indeed, not balkanize it, not silo it, not fragment it. Christ ever calls us out of our alienness and strangeness in society into a life of friendship and trust in the church. He calls us away from the increasing distractions and fragmenting of the world and to the unity of a covenanted, mission-oriented congregation. He calls us to be aware of idleness and indolence, to discern a common purpose, to serve each other and those far beyond our flock. As the German theologian Dorothy Zola wrote, the best translation of what the early Christians called love, agape, is still community. God's love, the love and care of the model shepherd, means community, coming together and taking care of the community of the church and the wider world. May it be so for the congregation of First Church, especially as they go into their annual meeting. Amen.